Good morning and welcome. Hope all of you had a lovely dinner yesterday and managed to get some sleep. My name is Anand Bhan. I'm a member of the steering committee. And with my colleague Tekchuan, we'll be taking you through a quick sort of summary recap of yesterday's discussions. So as you all know, we are here for GFBR 2017, which is focused on the ethics of alternative clinical trial designs and methods in LMIC country settings. I understand I asked Sushmita very quickly this morning. We have 93 participants from across the globe, and as always is the case with GFBR, most of our participation is from LMIC settings, and I think that really adds to the allure of this meeting and the kind of discussions that we have. And in the post-recent Ebola world, I think the increasing role of alternative, adaptive, innovative clinical trial designs is becoming more and more important, and I think that's where it becomes really crucial to explore some of the ethical and regulatory aspects related to that. So obviously, why are we discussing this topic? There is an argument which a lot of folks have made about the need for more efficient science, which can accelerate vaccine, drug development, research on new interventions, making clinical trials more socially and adaptable as well as acceptable, and how do we find out mechanisms which can enable that is sort of the core of what we've been discussing. There's clearly a gap in guidelines and regulations. There's not enough discussion which has happened on the ethical facets of such kind of designs, and I think that's where there is a role for meetings like this. Having said that, I think you've all received background reading material. There is a growing literature in this area. A lot of that literature is very much focused on high-income country settings, but having said that, there is something to learn from that, and I think it's important that for those of us who want to take this conversation forward, we need to keep engaging with that literature which is coming up in this area. Just this past week, Alex London, who's a good friend of many of us, has, for example, published this paper in the Journal of Medical Ethics speaking about learning health systems, clinical equipoise, and the ethics of responsive adaptive randomization. So obviously, there is a lot of critical thinking happening in this space, and we need to engage with that as well. So some of the key issues which came up during our discussion: cost is a major factor from a sponsor perspective, a health systems perspective, a resource investment perspective, and hence there is a need for these kind of clinical trial designs. At the same time, time is a major constraint. We've seen from recent epidemics that we sometimes have an evolution of a research design, but by the time we actually get to the field, the epidemic might be already waning or already over, and hence there is a need for more an expediency with the kind of work that we do. There is a population level variability. We saw that in the discussion around HIV prevention studies, and hence there is again a need to look at these areas and designs across population subsets. If our aim at sort of the downstream end should be about enabling evidence-based policy making, but how do we aid our policymakers in making that kind of decisions? How do we ensure that they make those decisions once we have the evidence out there? And how do we preclude them from finding ways of faulting the evidence? So, ensuring that those gaps are also addressed at the same time. Capacity remains a major constraint. I think that was a recurring theme yesterday as well. How can we work with our researchers in LMIC settings, with regulators, ethics committees, so that they are better able to understand these kinds of designs, whether it's around the risks, the powers, the calculations, the biases, the limitations and strengths of these kind of designs, and how can we help them better understand and digest the scientific aspects, but also be able to be discerning in being able to engage with the ethical issues in such approaches. And if we really want to deploy some of these designs in LMIC settings, then how can we plan in advance to build such country level or regional level capacity? And how can we do a continuous engagement in terms of refinement of approaches from a scientific as well as regulatory and ethics perspective? Perhaps we need to take these kind of discussions, the global forum, to the regional and local level, where researchers, ethicists, statisticians can come together and have some of these discussions. We must remember that ethics committees, for example, are usually understaffed and overworked, and hence it becomes challenging. So we need to be able to respond to their needs as well in being able to ensure that we do a better job. Now, in terms of key issues which arose, issues around collecting data from, say, a control arm and not responding to their needs, which might be health needs. So how do we deal with that? What are the ethical issues? What kind of community engagement do you need to do? The use of financial incentives purely for reimbursement purposes for research participation versus as a key element of the intervention itself, the role of which is being investigated through that research study. The role of nuance, do we use the word coercion too easily? Is there a nuanced part to the use of money in research or the use of an incentive in research. How do we deal with designs which are adapted during implementation themselves, the flexibility of approach? What kind of oversight mechanisms do we need? Our ethics committee is the best one. If you have an AI mechanism, what kind of oversight mechanism do you need to build in? The kind of interface with the health system where you have the involvement of the health system in the intervention or in the research design, the role of health system functionaries, including either as research agents or serving as research participants, and how do we deal with that from an ethics perspective? The role of gatekeepers at the local community level, but also the political leadership which is involved. How do we deal with issues around delays in providing the intervention? Does that interface with equipoise? Does that disturb equipoise in any way? Is it ethically acceptable? On what grounds are such delays acceptable from a logistical perspective, administrative perspective, political or research design science perspective? In terms of consent, what kind of consent modification, adaptation is acceptable, is something, how much flexibility do current regulations leave us with at each local level? Is waiver of consent, for example, appropriate for cluster level interventions or for innovative clinical trial designs? Is it acceptable not to gain individual level patient consent for use of their data? The other issue obviously was the level of care for the control group. Is there a minimum basic care that we need to offer our control group? Or does that need to be better than status quo, for example, offered by the public health system? Is there a duty to rescue which kicks in? The whole discussion around research versus evaluation, I think, was consumed a fair part of one of the sessions yesterday. What is research? Where is evaluation? What kind of overlaps exist? What kind of ethics mechanisms kick in for oversight? Yet at the same time, I think an important issue is, at the end of the day, what is the outcome of interest that you have? If the outcome of interest is saving lives, as is shown in this paper, which was also published last week, where they showed that quality improvement strategies, very simply done in newborn settings, newborn care settings, can actually save lives, then that's where I think our focus should be. How can we enable this kind of science, whether that's an evaluation science, whether it's a research design? And there is also a growing movement, for example, within the healthcare domain, focusing on the use of checklists for quality improvement. Are our ethics and regulatory systems geared up to be supportive of such approaches? If we have innovative designs, do we need an ethics review? Do we need an ethics oversight mechanism? Or do we need ethics approvals? And are they different from each other? And what kind of justifications we can offer for each of the choices that we made? We often end up conflating research ethics review with ethics review of any kind, whether it is through an evaluation mechanism or oversight mechanism. We might, for example, want to do oversight through experts, whether at the departmental level, at technical level. We might have a quality improvement oversight committee mechanism, which is an alternate to a purist ethics review mechanism. And how can we work with other stakeholders, like journal editors, who might insist on an ethics review approval for publication, which becomes a constraint for doing some of this science. So obviously we came to if we can come to some conclusions from the discussions we've had, and we'll have more discussions today, we need to obviously explore the post-trial aspects of some of these discussions. I don't think we went into real depth yesterday. Are, for example, adaptive platform trials ethically preferable to standard randomized control trials? What's the evidence towards that? What is the role of, in inverted commas, unbiased algorithms or combined factorial approaches in some of these decision making? The Pecha-kucha sessions, I think, were fairly good yesterday. We got some good country level snapshots. We got some diversity of understanding of how, at the country level, regulatory and ethics review approaches are operating. And also the interface with new mechanisms or new areas of doing research, for example, in complementary and alternative medicine, and the need for interface with other experts. Now, having said that, I want to leave you with some thoughts. I think there is a lot of excitement about adaptive clinical trials. There is a lot of interest in these new kinds of science. But at the same time, we need to also understand that this is a growing area of science where everyone is trying to understand this area. It is not yet an established form of science. There is a lot of learning involved. And beyond that excitement that all of us have for these kind of trials, we need to be cautionary and be discerning about the kind of science we're talking about and the kind of ethics approaches required. And moving forward, need to make sure that these designs move towards learning health systems where overall delivery of optimized quality interventions can be assured. How can we work in the LMIC context to ensure that we are able to better deal with and understand these approaches and have the capacity to deploy these designs? rather than being stuck with either a lack of knowledge or being very focused on just narrow interpretations around consent requirements. And what if that is true, then what kind of materials and trainings do we require for research ethics committees? How can we achieve that? And perhaps part of that is ensuring that we have adequate budgeting for training and capacity building in this area. Just to remind you, we are having a very active social media stream on Twitter, discussing some of these areas, covering the discussions happening both in the panel and the plenary discussions, but also the small groups. So please do participate and share your perspectives. And welcome to day 2 of the meeting. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Teck-Chuan from Singapore, from a Center for Biomedical Ethics based at the National University of Singapore. Anand has given a very comprehensive overview of what happened yesterday. I must admit that I'm a newbie to this topic itself, the ethics of adaptive or these new innovative trial designs. And I was just reflecting yesterday what this all means ethically speaking, right? So I was looking at the conference holder that was given, and this was the design that was given to me. It's a lion, and Thai home Mali, I think it means jasmine rice from Thailand. And I was wondering why the sign of a lion was used as the design. I don't think there are lions in Thailand. So I guess it's the symbolic value of what a lion means, right? It's strong, and therefore this symbol might be ethically preferable than other sort of symbols. So that sort of brings me to understanding why we want to prefer or use non-traditional RCT designs. And I think we can unpack the kind of reasons into scientific, right, practical and ethical. So essentially, a lot of this is governed by, as Anand pointed out, efficiency. So that even applies to ethics or the value of beneficence. So the idea here is that with all these new designs, we're able to roll out the potentially beneficent interventions faster to participants who really benefit from them. So all this, of course, has to be governed by contextual understanding, right, of many issues at hand. Of course, there's what is the nature of the disease or health condition being investigated, right? So given that we are trying to do population health interventions, so perhaps outcomes have to be understood at a cluster or group level, and therefore individual outcomes are perhaps less important. We have to understand the nature of the treatment, okay, the likely effectiveness, which is why some of these trials are being used with such designs in the first place. There must be at least a range of options, right? It can't be just a treatment for which there's only about 2 options, so there's no sense in which we want to use a more adaptive sort of design to the approach to testing the intervention at hand. Now, of course, duration is also another matter, right? If there's a very long time frame in which we know the outcome, then some of the designs would not be particularly useful. So all this, of course, has to be set upon resource settings, these preferences of the stakeholders as well as the behavior of participants themselves. So if you look at case 1 yesterday, the poly-Iran study, right? We know that there's a sharing of medicine among the community itself. So there's a risk of contamination if we were to do the traditional RCT, which is why a cluster approach might be the better approach. Now, I sort of summarize and sort of denote these key issues and challenges into methodological. I won't go into this because it's been covered by Anand to some extent. Distinction between research and implementation study, defining the participants, right? And what I want to say about all these issues is that there's some relationship between the science and the ethics itself, right? And secondly, between all the various ethical issues, such as consent. So if you were to understand who the participants are in the first place, this has implications for whom you ought to get consent for and whom you ought to provide post-trial provisions for. Right? So there are many other issues such as justice. So one of the key issues with step-wedge design is this delayed access to the treatment at hand. And so we have to think more about whether or not it's equitable. But part of the reason we have to think about whether, in trying to think about the ethics of equity itself, you have to link it to some extent with equipoise, right? So the understanding is that, look, these are beneficent, these are beneficial interventions in the first place. So why not give out to all the various clusters, for example? And the understanding is that, well, maybe it is useful in the long run, but there may be some implementation issues that we do not know, as well as the risk profile of all these things as you roll in different communities. So there's some sense in which there's still lack of understanding, lack of uncertainty, lack of disagreement on how best to roll out things, right? Which is why there might be, if you think about all these various other factors at hand, things might look more equitable if you roll out in a step-wedge manner. So of course, there's all this political interference. I think we saw in one of the case study. Okay, so how do we sort of negotiate our researchers? How do we negotiate their relationship with all these health policy makers who might want to roll out or might not want to roll out the particular intervention at hand? So as you saw in one of the case study, the choice of randomization of a cluster was not essentially given to randomization, but essentially it was chosen by the political makers. So thinking ahead, I think Anna has given us many questions, and I just like leave you with two. So to what extent should traditional ethical values such as respect for persons be maintained in trials with novel alternative designs, right? So we understand that insofar as the intervention is done at a population level with multiple group of people, consent at the individual level might not be the most feasible way to go about it. But then how do we still try to respect these people? Is there some sort of public education method or informational method that we can use to ensure that they at least understand they are in the trial, and what sort of recourse they have if they do not want to be in the trial, right? And then how do we effectively communicate the characteristics and advantages of all these novel designs to stakeholders, such as RRBs, gatekeepers, right? So as I understand from at least for an adaptive trial design, the benefit-risk ratio might evolve over time. So in a given sort of usual way in which you apply for research approval through an IRB, all these sort of risk benefits have to be sort of laid out and determined and communicated to the participants before the research will be given the go-ahead. So given that these are evolving risk-benefit ratio, how do we sort of set this understanding to the relevant approval committees as well as the participants, okay, who in some sense will be facing risk from being involved in such studies? So that's all we have. And may the main conference begin. Thank you.